Dr. Sophia Lakewood had perfected the art of being forgotten. As she moved through the crowded hallways of the Global Historical Archives, she chose her path with calculated precision, halfway between the main thoroughfare and the shadows, where she could observe everything while remaining practically invisible. At 42, Sophia had learned that academic obscurity was both a curse and a shield. Her understated clothing, hair pulled back in a practical bun, and minimal accessories created the perfect camouflage in the prestigious institution where flashy credentials and family connections typically determined whose research mattered. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The only detail that might catch a trained observer's eye was how she arranged her research materials. Notebook precisely centered. Reference guides positioned for instant access. Primary source documents arranged in a pattern that suggested years spent in archives, where a misplaced paper could mean months of lost work. Everything positioned with the muscle memory of someone who'd learned that, in the world of historical authentication, disorder could cost you everything. The grand conference room of the archives hummed with the particular energy that emerges when academic historians, museum curators, and private collectors converge in the same space. Everyone trying to prove their credentials were more impressive. Everyone certain they deserved the spotlight. At the head table, Dr. Victor Hargrove leaned back in his leather chair like he owned the building, his Harvard pin gleaming on his lapel, profile straight out of an academic journal cover. Next to him, Dr. Rebecca Chun spread her presentation materials across the polished mahogany with the confidence of someone who'd never had her research questioned. Director William Barrett entered carrying his customary leather portfolio, the kind of entrance that announced this wouldn't be a brief meeting. The overhead lights caught the silver in his temples as he surveyed the assembled scholars with the weary expression of someone who'd been navigating academic politics since before half of them had earned their first degree. "Let's begin, colleagues," Barrett announced, his voice cutting through the chatter. "We have a significant historical authentication project ahead of us. The McAllister collection represents the most comprehensive assembly of Civil War correspondence ever discovered. Our job is to authenticate, preserve, and prepare these documents for the national exhibition next year." The scenario sounded impressive. On paper, a coordinated authentication process involving comparative analysis, chemical dating, and contextual verification. Sophia's official role, as outlined in the project brief, was supplementary research consultant and contextual verification. Academics speak for we need someone to handle the tedious background work, while the prestigious names take the credit. As Barrett outlined the project objectives, the conversation naturally gravitated toward Hargrove and Chun. They traded methodological insights, like they were planning the discovery of the century, their voices carrying that easy confidence that comes from years of having your opinions automatically validated by peers and publications. Sophia listened, taking notes in her compact, efficient handwriting, occasionally glancing at the preliminary catalog of letters mounted on the digital display. When Barrett opened the floor for initial questions, Sophia raised her hand slightly. "Sir, based on the preliminary scan of the Fredericksburg correspondence, there are inconsistencies in the handwriting patterns compared to verified samples from General McAllister's other letters." Chun looked up with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Appreciate the observation, Dr. Lakewood, but we've already run preliminary authentication. The variations are well within the expected parameters for field-written correspondence." "Exactly," Hargrove added with a practiced smirk. "Research associates always focus on minor inconsistencies. These letters were written during a war, often by candlelight or while injured. Variation is expected." A few chuckles rippled around the table, the kind of polite dismissal that made it clear the conversation was moving on. Sophia simply nodded and made a note in her book. the same way she'd been making notes for over 15 years in rooms where people underestimated the quiet woman in the corner. 20 minutes later, when Barrett asked about the provenance timeline, Sophia tried. Again. Sir, if we're looking at a continuous chain of ownership, the gap between 1879 and 1883 shows. Dr. Hargrove interrupted with practiced patience, his tone suggesting he was explaining something obvious to a child. We've been authenticating historical correspondence since before half the people in this room had their degrees. Minor gaps in provenance are common for Civil War-era documents. The family simply didn't record the transfer during those years. More nods around the table, more polite smiles. Sophia wrote something else in her notebook and stayed quiet, her expression as neutral as the archival gloves she wore. The pattern continued as the meeting dragged toward its second hour. When the discussion moved to chemical authentication protocols, Sophia raised her hand one more time. Given the composition of the ink and the environmental conditions where these were supposedly stored, we should consider. Chun didn't even look up from her tablet. The chemical analysis is already covered, Dr. Lakewood. We've got standard protocols and verification procedures. This isn't our first major authentication. This time, nobody even bothered to chuckle. They just moved forward like she hadn't spoken at all, their attention focused on the scholars who looked like they belonged on academic journal covers. As the meeting wound toward its conclusion, Barrett opened the floor for final questions and concerns. Sophia glanced at her notes one more time, then raised her hand. Sir, I'd recommend we cross-reference these letters with the Harrison papers at the University of Virginia. There are overlapping timelines that could verify or contradict these accounts. Standard authentication already covers comparative analysis, Hargrove said dismissively, his tone suggesting the question itself was amateur. We don't need to overcomplicate procedures that have worked for decades. Barrett nodded approvingly. Exactly right. Anything else? Sophia looked around the table, meeting eyes that had already dismissed her contributions, then closed her notebook with deliberate precision. No, sir, nothing else. But her pen moved across a fresh page, writing something in the margin that no one else could see, something that would prove more important than anyone in that room could possibly imagine. The next morning's follow-up meeting revealed the depth of the problem Sophia was facing. Director Barrett had assembled what he called his core authentication team. Hargrove, Chun, and two museum conservators who seemed more interested in their coffee than the historical materials. Sophia's invitation had apparently been an afterthought, her name added to the distribution list with a note that read optional. Attendance. She attended anyway, taking the same position at the back of the room, watching as the authentication process took shape around assumptions that made her increasingly uncomfortable. Chun dominated the discussion, her voice carrying across the room as she outlined verification timelines that seemed dangerously optimistic. We'll have preliminary authentication completed within 2 weeks, she announced, tapping her tablet with manicured nails. Chemical analysis and handwriting verification in 10 days. Full contextual validation by day 14. Sophia studied the digital scans of the letters displayed on the wall monitor. The letterhead insignia on the military correspondence seemed just slightly off, the eagle's wing position different from verified examples she'd studied for years. The ink composition readings were within acceptable parameters but clustered at the very edge of historical accuracy. Sir, she said evenly, if we examine these letterhead insignias against the verified examples in the National Archives database, you'll notice the wing position on the eagle is Dr. Chun cut her off, her tone sharper than before. Leave the authentication to the experts with specialized training. Dr. Lakewood, we've got standardized protocols for verification. The dismissal landed with a thud that seemed to echo off the walls. Hargrove's smirk widened noticeably. The museum representatives suddenly found their coffee fascinating. Sophia's pen didn't pause. She just wrote something else in her notebook, her expression remaining as neutral as the pH-balanced paper they were examining. Director Barrett either didn't notice the tension or chose to ignore it. He moved on to reading assignments from his checklist, his voice taking on the bureaucratic tone of someone filling required boxes. Dr. Lakewood, supplementary research and contextual verification. You'll be responsible for background checks and supporting documentation as needed. The way he said it made her role sound like an afterthought, something to satisfy a funding requirement, rather than contribute to historical accuracy. Understood, sir, Sophia replied, her voice giving away nothing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. During the coffee break, scholars clustered in small groups around digital displays and pastries that had seen better days. Sophia stood near the window, paper cup in hand, observing the dynamic she'd seen play out in academic circles from Oxford to Stanford. The informal hierarchy was already established. Hargrove and Chun at the center of every conversation. Junior researchers orbiting around them like planets around twin suns. A young graduate student in horn-rimmed glasses approached her hesitantly, glancing around to make sure nobody was watching. Dr. Lakewood? You probably don't remember me. Your seminar at Columbia 3 years ago. Sophia tilted her head slightly, her memory accessing files most people would never know existed. James Whitfield. Your dissertation examined forgeries in Revolutionary War correspondence. His eyes widened with surprise and something that looked like relief. Yes, exactly. I never got the chance to thank you properly. That methodology you shared for identifying period-accurate ink compositions, it became the foundation of my entire research approach. Just sharing what I've learned, Mr. Whitfield. Whitfield looked like he wanted to say more, then seemed to think better of it as Chun's voice carried across the room. He gave Sophia a respectful nod and melted back into the crowd, but not before Sophia noticed him glancing at the senior researchers, with an expression that suggested he knew something they didn't. When the break ended, Sophia took her assigned seat and watched Chun and Hargrove pick up their authentication discussion exactly where they'd left off. Their credentials were impressive, their experience undeniable, but their dismissal of outside input was creating blind spots that grew wider with every decision. As the meeting concluded, Sophia gathered her materials with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. Around her, conversations continued about spectrographic analysis and handwriting verification, preservation techniques and exhibition layouts, standard procedures for people who made their living validating history's artifacts. But something about Whitfield had stuck with her. The look in his eyes when he mentioned her methodology. The way he'd glanced at the senior researchers with what she now recognized as concern. He'd been in situations where dismissing outside analysis had consequences measured in permanent damage to historical understanding and reputations destroyed when forgeries were later exposed. As she walked toward her assigned workspace, Sophia's mind was already analyzing patterns, identifying potential authentication failures, and developing verification approaches that hadn't occurred to anyone else yet. It was what she'd been trained to do, what she'd been doing successfully for over 15 years in institutions, where her name never appeared in the acknowledgments. Though the question wasn't whether something was wrong with the McAllister collection. The question was whether anyone would listen when she tried to prevent a massive historical fraud from being validated by one of the most prestigious institutions in the country. By the third day of authentication sessions, the pattern of dismissal had become so routine that Sophia could predict it. She'd raise a concern based on her research. One of the senior scholars would cut her off with practiced condescension, and the process would move forward as if she hadn't spoken. It was like being trapped in an academic version of Groundhog Day, except historical truth and institutional credibility hung in the balance. The morning meeting started badly and got worse. Preliminary chemical analysis showed inconsistencies in paper aging that suggested at least some documents were much newer than their purported 1860s origin. Sophia had spent the previous evening analyzing fiber composition reports and ink chromatography, identifying patterns that pointed to sophisticated modern forgery techniques. "Sir," she began as Director Barrett opened the floor for updates. "The overnight analysis indicates at least 7 letters have paper with lignin levels, inconsistent with mid-19th century manufacturing processes, Dr. Lakewood." Hargrove interrupted with exaggerated patience, his tone carrying the kind of condescension usually reserved for first-year graduate students. "Variations in chemical markers are well documented in papers from different mills. That's why we use comprehensive authentication processes rather than isolated tests." Chun nodded approvingly from across the table. "We've authenticated Civil War documents for 20 years. Material variations are precisely why we don't rely on single-factor analysis." The dismissal stung more than usual, partly because Sophia could see the historical deception taking shape with crystalline clarity. The McAllister collection wasn't just containing a few questionable items. It appeared to be a sophisticated, coordinated forgery designed to create a false historical narrative about a Civil War, General's secret communications with Lincoln. "With respect, sir," Sophia pressed, her voice remaining steady despite the frustration building in her chest. "The pattern of inconsistencies suggests deliberate fabrication rather than period variations." "What I suggest," Hargrove said, his voice taking on an edge that made junior researchers shift uncomfortably in their seats, "is that we let people with specialized training handle the primary authentication. Supplementary research is important, but it's not authoritative in this context." The room went quiet in the way that happens when someone crosses a line they probably shouldn't have. Sophia felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her expression neutral, her pen moving across her notebook in the same steady rhythm that had carried her through meetings in institutions where showing weakness could get your career destroyed. "Director." Barrett cleared his throat diplomatically. "Let's stay focused on the exhibition timeline. We unveil in 3 months regardless of theoretical concerns." Theoretical concerns. Sophia closed her notebook and spent the rest of the meeting in silence, watching as the authentication process solidified around assumptions that grew more dangerous by the hour. When the session ended, she gathered her materials and headed for her assigned workspace, a small research room tucked away from the main authentication lab. The room was lined with reference volumes and carried the faint smell of archive-grade paper and preservation chemicals. Sophia settled at her corner desk, the one connected directly to the historical database, and began doing what she did best, reading historical patterns like a language she'd been speaking her entire adult life. What she found confirmed her worst fears. The McAllister letters contained subtle anachronisms, turns of phrase that weren't in common usage until decades later, references to events that wouldn't have been known to the supposed writer at that time, and most damning of all, handwriting variations that matched known forgery patterns in her specialized database. Sophia stared at the evidence displayed across multiple screens, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility that came with seeing historical frauds others couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge. She'd been in this position before in institutions, where her warnings had been dismissed right up until the moment they proved accurate, usually after the damage was done and reputations were destroyed. The difference was that those incidents had remained relatively contained, affecting single documents or small collections. The McAllister collection was set to become the centerpiece of a national exhibition with global attention, a fraud of unprecedented scale and ambition. She opened a secure email channel, not to the authentication team, but to an address that existed in academic directories, accessible only to specialists with specific credentials. The message she composed was brief, professional, and would trigger protocols that most people in the building didn't know existed. As she prepared to send the communication, Sophia's mind drifted to other conference rooms, other authentications where her analysis had been dismissed until reality forced everyone to pay attention. The pattern was always the same: confidence giving way to concern, concern escalating to crisis, and crisis demanding solutions from people who'd been ignored when solutions were still possible. She sent the message and cleared her browser. History. Her movements automatic after years of operating in environments where academic politics could compromise careers and destroy decades of work. If anyone had been monitoring her research, they would have seen routine historical reference activities. But nobody was monitoring Sophia Lakewood's activities, which was exactly how she preferred to operate. The authentication process would proceed as planned, with senior scholars confident in their academic superiority and dismissive of outside warnings. Sophia would be stationed in her research room, providing contextual verification to teams that might or might not incorporate what she had to say. What they didn't know was that she'd already taken steps to ensure that when their mistakes were exposed, and they would be exposed, someone would be positioned to set them right. Sophia arrived at the Global Historical Archives 3 hours before the authentication team's scheduled start time, when the corridors were still quiet and the coffee was fresh enough to be palatable. The authentication floor hummed with the controlled energy of pre-session preparation, banks of monitors displaying high-resolution scans of the McAllister letters, specialized equipment warming up for the day's chemical analysis. Her assigned research desk was positioned along the back wall, close enough to monitor the authentication process, but far enough from the central examination table to reinforce her peripheral role. She didn't mind the placement. It gave her clear sightlines to every display in the room and put her within range of database access that wasn't part of the official authentication protocols. As she powered up her systems, Sophia methodically accessed historical reference sources that painted a picture the senior scholars either couldn't or wouldn't see. The supposed McAllister letters contained subtle but undeniable anachronisms, references to railway lines that weren't constructed until years later, turns of phrase that weren't in common usage during the Civil War, and handwriting inconsistencies that matched known forgery patterns in her specialized database. More troubling were the content discrepancies she'd been monitoring for the past 72 hours. Short passages that contradicted verified historical accounts, subtle alterations to established timelines, and most damning of all, political opinions attributed to General McAllister that contradicted his well-documented public statements and private correspondence held in other collections. The pattern suggested not just a sophisticated forgery, but a deliberate attempt to rewrite a significant figure's historical legacy. If authenticated, these letters would fundamentally alter how historians understood McAllister's relationship with Lincoln and his views on emancipation, creating a false narrative that would be cited in textbooks for generations. Sophia opened her research notebook and began documenting what she was seeing, cross-referencing the suspect letters with verified historical accounts, building a comprehensive picture of what the authentication team would actually validate versus what they should be questioning. The discrepancies were significant enough to fundamentally undermine the entire collection's legitimacy. At 0-4 hours, the Authentication Center began filling with personnel. Director Barrett arrived with his usual leather portfolio, followed by the senior researchers who would oversee the day's verification procedures from their positions around the central examination table. Hargrove and Chun appeared in perfectly pressed attire, their confident voices filling the room like a physical presence. Looking forward to completing the primary authentication today, Chun announced to nobody in particular, her voice carrying across the room. Should be a landmark addition to Civil War scholarship. Hargrove nodded approvingly while checking the equipment one final time. assuming everyone sticks to established protocols and doesn't overcomplicate the process. The comment was clearly directed at Sophia, who continued her database checks without acknowledgement. She'd learned years ago that responding to such provocations only escalated tensions without changing minds. Better to let evidence speak louder than arguments. At 0-2 hours, the authentication briefing began with Director Barrett, reviewing final procedures and verification protocols. Sophia listened from her position at the research workstation, noting how little attention was paid to the contextual inconsistencies she documented. The process proceeded as if the letters were presumed authentic rather than subjected to rigorous skepticism. When Barrett opened the floor for final questions, Sophia raised her hand. "Sir, based on overnight research, I recommend we delay certification, pending cross-reference with the Harrison papers." The timeline discrepancies regarding the Chancellorsville, Dr. Lakewood, Hargrove interrupted with barely concealed irritation. "We've been over this multiple times. The authentication parameters are established, rehearsed, and optimized for exhibition deadlines. Making last-minute changes based on theoretical historical connections creates more problems than it solves." Director Barrett nodded decisively. "The process remains as scheduled. All units will proceed as briefed." Sophia marked something in her notebook and remained silent for the rest of the briefing. Around her, the pre-authentication energy continued building as personnel took their positions and ran final equipment checks. The atmosphere was professional, confident, and completely unprepared for what the historical evidence suggested was coming. As the final countdown approached 0-1 hour, Sophia accessed database connections that existed outside the official authentication parameters. The comparative analysis she monitored confirmed what her research had predicted. The McAllister collection contained sophisticated forgeries designed to exploit every assumption built into the authentication process. She composed a brief message on a secure terminal, addressing it to the same classified directory she'd contacted the previous day. This time, the message contained specific verification recommendations based on real-time historical analysis, alternatives to the standard authentication protocols, and timing modifications that could prevent the institution from certifying what appeared to be a carefully constructed historical fraud. The message was acknowledged within minutes. The response contained only a timestamp and a reference number that told Sophia her recommendations had been received and were being processed at levels above her clearance authorization. As the final countdown began, Sophia settled into her assigned role as research consultant and contextual verification, monitoring data feeds that painted an increasingly clear picture of approaching academic disaster. The authentication teams were proceeding toward certification of documents that displayed characteristics the verification protocols refused to acknowledge. She opened a fresh page in her notebook and began documenting the sequence of events that was about to unfold, knowing that accurate records would be essential for the post-authentication analysis that would inevitably follow. What the senior scholars didn't understand was that Sophia's real job wasn't to provide supplementary research for predetermined conclusions. Her job was to protect historical truth and ensure that American history wasn't corrupted by sophisticated forgeries. Regardless of whether her colleagues listened to her analysis or dismissed it as theoretical concerns, today she would discover whether 15 years of experience in institutions that rarely acknowledged her contributions had prepared her for what came next. The first phase of the McAllister authentication began under the sterile white lights of the examination lab. Climate-controlled air thick with preservation chemicals and the electric tension that comes before something goes fundamentally wrong. From her position at the research station, Sophia watched the digital countdown reach 0 hour while monitoring historical references that painted an increasingly ominous picture. The room had settled into operational focus. Banks of monitors casting blue and white light across the faces of specialists who believed they were about to witness a landmark contribution to Civil War scholarship. Conversations died as specialized. Equipment hummed to life and attention focused on the high-resolution displays, showing real-time analysis of the first batch of letters. Beginning primary chemical authentication in 30 seconds, the lead technician announced. The first document appeared on Sophia's left monitor, the supposedly crucial letter from McAllister to Lincoln regarding early emancipation discussions. From the beginning, Sophia tracked contextual inconsistencies on her specialized research terminal. The historical markers were positioning exactly as her analysis had predicted, revealing linguistic patterns that would turn the celebrated collection into carefully prepared historical fabrications. Initial chemical markers consistent with period-appropriate materials. Hargrove's voice came through the communication system, measured and professional. Paper composition within expected parameters. Handwriting analysis progressing on schedule, Chun replied from her station, confidence evident in her tone. Initial pattern matching shows consistency with verified McAllister documents. For the first 20 minutes, everything appeared textbook perfect. The chemical analysis registered acceptable levels for period-appropriate materials. The handwriting analysis showed pattern consistency within established parameters, and the contextual verification proceeded without raising immediate red flags. Then the authentication picture began deteriorating in ways that Sophia had been predicting for 3 days. Her specialized linguistic analysis software stuttered, froze for several seconds, then resumed with a startling alert. The text pattern showed subtle anachronisms that exceeded period-appropriate variation. Dr. Chun, your linguistic analysis is showing some irregularities, she called into the communication net. I'm registering multiple phrases that don't appear in American English usage until the 1880s. Copy that, came the strained reply. We're seeing some minor variations, possibly due to transcription error or personal idiosyncrasy in the writer's style. Before the explanation ended completely, the contextual verification alerts on Sophia's specialized display began flashing. The historical references within the text revealed multiple discrepancies with established timelines, mentioning events that hadn't yet happened when the letters were supposedly written. Sophia keyed her microphone with growing urgency. Dr. Hargrove, recommend you pause certification pending deeper contextual review. There are multiple historical inconsistencies in the Antietam letter that contradict verified accounts. Hargrove's response was immediate and dismissive. Negative, Dr. Lakewood. We're proceeding as planned. Minor historical variations are common in personal correspondence. Maintain research support and continue supplementary verification. On the main authentication display, Sophia watched the senior researchers continue processing letters at the scheduled pace, moving methodically through documents that contained increasingly obvious signs of forgery to trained eyes. The institution had turned what should have been a rigorous authentication into a rubber stamp process, driven by exhibition deadlines rather than historical accuracy. Inconsistency alert, the chemical analysis technician suddenly announced, his voice betraying the first hint of concern. Microscopic fiber analysis showing anomalous patterns in document 7. Chun moved quickly to the station, examining the results with a furrowed brow. Probably contamination from improper storage. Noted in the file but continue processing. The authentication center had gone quiet, except for the steady electronic beeping of scanning equipment, and murmured conversations between specialists comparing results. Sophia didn't say anything. She just watched the historical fraud she'd predicted 3 days ago unfold with the terrible precision of a carefully planned deception. Her expression remained as unreadable as the classified research she'd been studying all week. Around her, shoulders tensed and worried glances were exchanged as what had been presented as a landmark, historical discovery revealed itself to be something else entirely. A sophisticated forgery designed to rewrite a crucial chapter of Civil War history. The opposing force hadn't just gotten lucky. They'd been 3 moves ahead since the initial authentication session. The door to the authentication center opened without ceremony. No knock, no announcement, just the measured entry of someone who belonged wherever he decided to be. Dr. Edmund Winters stepped inside with the kind of quiet authority that made people straighten their posture without thinking about it. Sophia had seen the historian twice before, both times in specialized authentication seminars that officially never happened. Tall, distinguished, wearing a tailored suit without flashy accessories, he carried himself with the understated confidence of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that shaped academic institutions without his name ever appearing in the quothy. Acknowledgements. The two security personnel flanking him didn't follow him inside. They took positions outside the door with the professional stillness of people trained to secure a space, without making it obvious they were doing so. Director Barrett was on his feet instantly, confusion and concern flickering across his face. Senior federal historians didn't materialize at routine authentication sessions, especially ones that were proceeding according to schedule. "Dr. Winters, sir, wasn't expecting you today." Winters surveyed the chaos displayed across multiple monitors, chemical inconsistency alerts, linguistic anomaly warnings, contextual verification failures blinking ominously across the authentication displays. The kind of academic disaster that ended careers and triggered congressional oversight. "Got a message suggesting I might want to observe this particular authentication," Winters replied, his voice calm but carrying clearly across the room. "Heard you had an interesting collection to certify." His eyes swept the banks of monitors showing the authentication failures, the flashing anomaly indicators, and finally settled on Sophia. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as recognition flickered across his expression. "Didn't know you were assigned here, Dr. Lakewood." Sophia's pen paused over her notebook for the first time all morning. "Just for this authentication, sir." Heads turned throughout the center. Hargrove's confident posture stiffened noticeably. Chun glanced between the federal historian and Sophia, her forehead creasing like she was trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. Dr. Winters took a step closer to Director Barrett's central authentication position, still watching the live feed of chemical analysis showing inconsistencies that should have halted the certification process hours ago. "Why isn't she running authentication oversight?" Barrett hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "Dr. Lakewood is here for supplementary research, sir." "Contextual verification." "Supplementary research," Winters repeated slowly, like he was tasting something unpleasant. His gaze flicked back to Sophia, who continued taking notes as if federal historians materialized in her workspace every day. "Is that what we're calling it now?" Nobody in the room found the comment amusing. Winters didn't elaborate. He moved to the back wall, folded his arms, and settled in to watch both the continuing authentication failure and the reactions of the scholars who were watching it fail. But the question he'd left hanging in the air had already changed the atmosphere in ways that would have been impossible 10 minutes earlier. Curiosity was replacing indifference. Uncertainty was replacing overconfidence. And more than a few researchers were beginning to wonder what they didn't know about the quiet woman in the corner, who took notes while certifications collapsed around her. Winters stood quietly for several minutes, observing the authentication disaster unfold across the monitors. The chemical analysis remained stalled on multiple inconsistency alerts. Linguistic verification had flagged 17 anachronisms. Contextual analysis was showing direct contradictions with verified historical accounts. Finally, he stepped toward the bank of secure workstations along the wall where Sophia maintained her research feeds. "Director Barrett, I'll need access to a terminal. Full authorization." Barrett's hesitation was visible and understandable. "Sir, these systems are tied directly into classified historical databases. The access protocols require." "I'm aware of the protocols." Winters interrupted, his tone remaining conversational while leaving zero room for negotiation. Full authorization. A research assistant vacated his workstation without another word. Dr. Winters entered his credentials with the fluid precision of someone who'd performed this sequence countless times. The screen flashed security clearance warnings before settling into a menu interface that most personnel in the room had never seen. He navigated through security levels that existed above the clearance authorization of everyone present, except possibly Sophia herself. No hesitation, no hunting through directories. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the efficiency of someone accessing familiar systems. The room had gone completely silent except for the continued electronic beeping of authentication alerts from the failed certification process. Even the museum curator in the corner was staring, eyes wide, at the security clearances being accessed in real time. Dr. Winters typed, "Lakewood Sophia R., Ph.D." The response would change everything. The standard personnel screen appeared. First, Dr. Sophia Lakewood, historical research specialist, 15 years of service. Routine commendations for analytical work and authentication support. The sanitized summary that anyone with appropriate security clearance could access. The kind of professional biography that revealed nothing important about the person behind it. Then Dr. Winters entered a secondary authorization code. The screen transformed completely. Entire sections of previously blacked out text began dissolving, replaced with detailed mission logs, operational photographs, and classification markings that made several junior researchers instinctively look away. Deployments to authentication operations that didn't appear on any standard academic records. Specialized training in forgery detection methods restricted to federal investigators. The room had gone dead silent, except for the continued beeping of authentication failure alerts. Even seasoned museum curators were staring at the sheer volume of classified material scrolling past. Operations they'd heard, whispered about in secure facilities but never seen documented. Dr. Winters's voice remained conversational, but each word landed with the weight of absolute authority. 5 years embedded with specialized authentication. Teams investigating organized forgery networks. Lead historical verification specialist on operations you've read about in newspaper headlines, without knowing her name was attached to them. He scrolled to specific mission entries, pointing at classifications that made director-level scholars shift uncomfortably in their seats. 0 fraudulent certifications under her verification oversight. Not one historically significant forgery authenticated during operations she coordinated. The authentication displays continued showing the exercise failure, but nobody was watching the monitors anymore. All attention had focused on the classified record being displayed with methodical precision. Operation Gilded Page, the Southwestern Historical Society case. 47 fraudulent Civil War documents identified before certification. She prevented a major historical distortion that would have corrupted scholarship for decades. Another entry appeared on screen. Operation Archival Integrity, the Boston manuscript case. 3-year complete authentication blackout from local experts. She reconstructed the forgery network using nothing but linguistic analysis and contextual verification, saving the institution from certifying documents that would have undermined their credibility permanently. Winters scrolled to another classified entry, tapping the screen with his finger. Operation Legacy Preservation, directly analogous to the scenario running today. She identified 17 forgeries in a collection that had already passed. Preliminary authentication by 3 separate institutions prevented a certification that would have corrupted historical scholarship for generations. His eyes found Hargrove across the room, who was staring at the screen like he was reading hieroglyphics without a translation key. You know how many senior historians argued with her recommendations during that operation? Hargrove shifted, uncomfortably but remained silent. Winters continued, Because when she tells you the provenance is questionable, intelligent scholars examine the provenance more carefully. When she identifies contextual anachronisms that exceed your parameters, professional historians adjust their authentication approach accordingly. He closed the classified file with a single keystroke, the restricted text dissolving back into black bars and sanitized summaries, the official record returning to its harmless, unremarkable appearance. Winters straightened and looked directly at Sophia, who had continued taking notes throughout the entire revelation as if federal historians routinely exposed her classified background to rooms full of personnel. Permission to assume authentication oversight, Doctor. Sophia set her pen down with the same deliberate precision she applied to everything else, her expression revealing nothing about what she was thinking or feeling. Around her, the atmosphere had shifted so completely that the same scholars who'd been dismissing her analysis for 3 days were now watching her every movement. Permission granted, sir. The balance of power in the room had just shifted with the quiet efficiency of a perfectly executed academic maneuver. But the real demonstration was about to begin. Sophia rose from her research workstation with the unhurried movement of someone who had never doubted what came next. She crossed to the central authentication console as the lead technician vacated his position without being asked, the chair still warm from his oversight of a certification process that was failing in real time. The authentication displays showed a disaster in progress. Chemical analysis indicating inconsistent aging patterns. Linguistic verification flagging multiple anachronisms. Contextual verification showing direct contradictions with established historical accounts. The status board glowed red with authentication. Failures that would have destroyed institutional credibility if formally certified. Sophia settled at the command terminal. Authentication protocols pulled up on her screen, and surveyed the technical picture with eyes that had been reading similar displays in places where mistakes were measured in permanent damage to historical understanding rather than temporary embarrassment. Her voice, when it came over the communication system, carried an authority that had nothing to do with academic titles and everything to do with competence proven under conditions most of the personnel in the room couldn't imagine. Authentication team, implement full verification protocol 7 immediately. All preliminary certifications suspended pending comprehensive re-examination. Chun, redirect your linguistic analysis to focus on the Sharpsburg correspondence first. You have 30 seconds before that letter progresses to final approval. Chun's response came back tight, but compliant for the first time all week. Copy that. Redirecting analysis and suspending preliminary approval. Sophia switched verification protocols without waiting for confirmation, her fingers moving across controls with the precision of someone who had coordinated similar operations when failure meant something more permanent than professional embarrassment. Hargrove hold chemical certification for batch 3. Then advanced directly to microscopic fiber analysis on the Lincoln correspondence using pattern matching against verified White House stationery from the National Archives database. Her instructions flowed across multiple channels with the efficiency of a conductor directing an orchestra, each specialist receiving precise guidance based on historical analysis that had been dismissed for 3 days, but was now proving accurate with mechanical precision. Technical team, drop your standard parameters and implement forensic level examination protocol 5 on all ink samples. Flag any chemical markers inconsistent with mid-19th century manufacturing processes. The authentication picture transformed as her coordination took effect. Teams that had been proceeding along predetermined verification paths suddenly moved with purpose and precision, each element adjusting course based on expertise that painted the complete historical picture rather than fragments. Forgery confirmed, came the report from the chemical team. Batch 3 showing artificial aging compounds consistent with modern forgery techniques. Linguistic analysis complete. followed immediately. 7 confirmed anachronisms in the Sharpsburg letter alone. Statistically impossible for period documents. Sophia wasn't finished. She'd seen the complete forgery pattern now, and every move flowed from years of reading deception tactics in places where second chances didn't exist. Barrett, you need to secure all supplementary documentation immediately. The provenance papers themselves likely contain forged signatures and altered dates. Dr. Chun, redirect your team to examine the chain of custody documentation with particular attention to the ownership transfers between 1879 and 1883. Copy that. Securing documentation and redirecting verification. Imaging team, I need enhanced spectral analysis on the letterhead insignias. Compare wing position on the eagles against verified examples from the Library of Congress database. Focus particularly on the Fredericksburg correspondence. The radio chatter shifted from routine procedure to urgent, professional acknowledgments, as specialists executed examinations that had been invisible to everyone else in the room just minutes before. What had appeared to be a landmark historical discovery was transforming into a textbook case of sophisticated forgery detection. The status board began filling with authentication failure markers. Chemical analysis indicators showed modern compounds masked by artificial aging techniques. Linguistic verification flagged dozens of anachronisms across multiple documents. Handwriting analysis revealed subtle inconsistencies impossible in genuine correspondence. 20 minutes after Sophia assumed authentication oversight, the entire operation had reversed course completely. Specialists reported findings with increasing urgency. Authentication protocols identified forgery techniques with methodical precision. What had been rushed toward certification was now being systematically exposed as one of the most sophisticated historical frauds ever attempted. Command, this is Hargrove. His voice came over the system, this time without the edge of dismissive confidence that had characterized his earlier communications. We've confirmed artificial aging compounds in all tested documents. The entire collection appears compromised. Sophia didn't respond immediately. She was already logging final verification reports and marking the sequence of authentication failures for the investigation that would inevitably follow. When she did answer, her tone remained as professional and unremarkable as it had been throughout the process. Copy Hargrove. Outstanding detection work by all teams. Behind her, Dr. Winters watched without comment, arms folded, the faintest smile playing at the corner of his mouth as he observed a demonstration of competence that most of the room had spent 3 days failing to recognize. Around the authentication center, nobody was questioning the quiet research specialist anymore. The verification logs told a story that couldn't be argued with. A collection that had been rushed toward certification and exhibition was now recognized as a sophisticated forgery designed to rewrite Civil War history. The authentication session concluded under the hum of cooling equipment and subdued conversations of personnel logging final entries into systems that would generate reports nobody wanted to write. The verification displays showed failure where landmark discovery had seemed inevitable, expert detection where certification had been the goal, and leadership where none had been officially authorized. Director Barrett approached Dr. Winters, keeping his voice low enough that only nearby personnel could hear. Sir, I have to ask, how long have you known about Dr. Lakewood's specialized background? Winters's expression didn't change as he watched Sophia systematically secure her workstation with the same methodical precision she'd applied to everything else all week. Long enough to know that when she tells you something's wrong with a historical document, you listen. The institutions she's worked with have a habit of maintaining their credibility. Barrett glanced toward Sophia, who was powering down verification systems with movements that suggested she had performed this sequence thousands of times in places nobody in the room had clearance to know about. Why didn't she push harder during the authentication sessions? Demand that we listen to her analysis? Because that's not how specialists like her function, Director. They don't need to be the loudest voice in the briefing or the most prestigious name on the publication. They just need to ensure historical accuracy prevails and institutional credibility survives. When you've spent years in places where ego corrupts the historical record, you learn to save the lectures for after the authentication. Across the room, Chun finally approached Sophia directly, her earlier swagger replaced by something that looked like professional respect mixed with embarrassment. Dr. Lakewood, I owe you an apology. We were wrong to dismiss your contextual analysis. Sophia looked up from her console, her expression as neutral as it had been throughout the entire authentication process. No apology necessary, Dr. Chun. You were working with the methodologies available to you at the time. But you knew from the very beginning, you knew exactly how these forgeries would be exposed. I recognized the patterns, she corrected, with precision that suggested the distinction was important. Authentication analysis identifies inconsistencies and probabilities. What you do with that analysis determines whether possibilities become certainties. Chun nodded slowly, processing the difference between academic certainty and professional assessment. Will you be staying for the remainder of the authentication series? Just until Friday, then back to regular assignment. She paused, clearly wanting to ask another question, but uncertain how to phrase it properly. What exactly are regular duties for someone with your background? Sophia's smile was slight and revealed nothing classified. Teaching specialists to recognize forgery patterns, Dr. Chen, making sure they understand that the most dangerous historical frauds are usually the ones you underestimate. As personnel filtered out of the authentication center, more than a few paused to take another look at the woman they'd been dismissing all week. The quiet research specialist who had just demonstrated forgery detection expertise, most of them had only read about in classified authentication reports. Dr. Winters approached as Sophia completed her system shutdown, close enough that their conversation would remain private. You're still too comfortable disappearing into the background, Sophia. Maybe it's time you stop letting them underestimate you. She gave the smallest shrug, her expression unchanged. Not my job to be noticed, sir. Just to make sure historical accuracy prevails and institutional credibility survives. Perhaps, he replied. But sometimes the mission requires showing them exactly who they're dealing with before they need that expertise under live forgery conditions. Sophia didn't respond directly. She just continued securing her workstation with the same methodical attention to detail that had characterized everything she'd done since walking into the authentication room 3 days earlier. Outside, the museum was preparing for an exhibition that would now require complete reinvention. But inside the authentication center, the silence around Sophia spoke louder than any words could have. 3 days of dismissal and condescension had been replaced by the kind of professional respect that was earned rather than demanded. The quiet woman in the corner had just reminded everyone that the most capable people are often the ones you never notice. And that sometimes the difference between historical truth and catastrophic fraud comes down to whether you're smart enough to listen when expertise speaks quietly rather than loudly. In places where institutional credibility hung in the balance, that lesson was worth remembering. 2 weeks later, Sophia sat in her modest office at the Federal Historical Authentication Bureau, organizing files for her next assignment. The room was a stark contrast to the prestigious spaces at the Global Historical Archives, utilitarian, practical, designed for function rather than impression. The only personal touch was a small collection of antique fountain pens, arranged neatly on a side shelf. A knock at her door pulled her attention from the documents. James Whitfield, the graduate student from the McAllister Authentication, stood in the doorway, looking simultaneously nervous and determined. Dr. Lakewood, they said I might find you here. Sophia gestured to the chair across from her desk. Mr. Whitfield, I'm surprised to see you. He sat with the careful posture of someone who wasn't entirely sure he belonged there. It took some doing to track you down. This building doesn't exactly advertise its existence. That's rather the point, she replied with the ghost of a smile. What can I do for you? Whitfield placed a folder on her desk. I wanted to show you something. After the McAllister authentication, I started researching other collections that came through the same dealer. There's a pattern, subtle but consistent. I think there might be an organized network behind it. Sophia opened the folder, scanning the contents with practiced efficiency. The young researcher had compiled an impressive analysis, connecting acquisition dates, provenance patterns, and authentication methodologies across multiple institutions. It was the kind of detailed work that spoke of genuine talent. You've been busy, she said, continuing to review his findings. I couldn't stop thinking about what happened. How close we came to certifying those forgeries. How everyone dismissed your concerns until Dr. Winters arrived. Whitfield leaned forward, his expression earnest. And I realized something important. This field needs people who can recognize the patterns before the damage is done. Sophia set the folder down, studying the young man with new interest. Most people would have walked away from that experience, Mr. Whitfield. Found a less controversial specialization. I'm not most people. The simple statement carried a quiet determination that reminded Sophia of herself 15 years earlier, before classified operations and federal oversight became her normal. No, she agreed. You're not. She opened her desk drawer and removed a business card so plain it was almost austere. Just a phone number and an email address, no name or title. If you're serious about this path, call this number tomorrow. Ask for the Historical Authentication Training Program. Whitfield accepted the card with careful reverence, understanding its significance. They tried to erase you from history, you know. After the authentication, I looked for your publications, your conference presentations. There's almost nothing out there, just fragments, acknowledgments buried in footnotes. As if someone systematically removed your contributions from the record. Sophia's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes, a brief acknowledgement of a truth she'd lived with for years. Historical accuracy sometimes requires personal obscurity, Mr. Whitfield. Not everyone is comfortable with that trade. I think I could be, he said quietly, if it meant protecting the truth. 3 months later, Director Barrett stood at the podium in the main exhibition hall of the Global Historical Archives. Behind him, display cases stood empty where the McAllister collection had been scheduled for presentation. Instead, a new exhibition had taken shape, Authentication and Forgery, Protecting Historical Truth. The crowd filling the hall represented museums, universities, and historical societies from across the country. The authentication failure had made national headlines, but the institution had taken an unprecedented approach, transforming potential embarrassment into educational opportunity. Today we open an exhibition that came from our own painful lesson. Barrett began, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. When the McAllister collection was exposed as a sophisticated forgery, we faced a choice: bury the incident or learn from it. We chose the latter. Behind him, the main screen displayed authentication technologies, forgery detection methods, and historical context analysis, turning the verification process itself into the exhibit rather than its intended subject. This exhibition would not exist without the expertise and integrity of someone whose contributions to historical authentication have gone largely unrecognized. Someone who saw what the rest of us missed because we were too focused on prestige. To recognize the truth, Barrett gestured toward the side of the stage. Dr. Sophia Lakewood has spent 15 years protecting historical institutions from fraud and forgery, often without recognition or acknowledgement. Today, she's agreed to step out of the shadows to help us launch a new initiative, the Center for Historical Authentication and Verification Ethics. Sophia walked onto the stage with the same measured composure she brought to everything, neither seeking the spotlight nor shrinking from it. The applause that greeted her carried something beyond polite acknowledgement, a recognition of expertise that had been overlooked for too long. As she took her position at the podium, Sophia surveyed the room with eyes that had seen countless authentication failures and prevented many more. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority that had always been there, waiting for someone to listen. "History isn't just what happened," she began. "It's what we can prove happened through rigorous verification and ethical authentication. When we certify a document as genuine, we're not just validating paper and ink, we're shaping how future generations will understand their past." The room had gone completely silent, scholars and curators leaning forward to catch every word. For too long, historical authentication has been vulnerable to pressure from exhibition deadlines, acquisition competitions, and institutional prestige. Today, we begin changing that culture. On the screens behind her, images appeared of young researchers, James Whitfield among them, working with specialized equipment and analyzing documents with meticulous care. The center will train a new generation of authentication specialists who understand that historical truth matters more than academic recognition, who recognize that sometimes the most important contribution you can make is preventing a fraud from corrupting the historical record. In the back of the hall, Dr. Winters watched with arms folded and the satisfaction of someone seeing a long overdue recognition finally realized. Beside him stood a serious woman in a government suit, who leaned over to speak quietly. "You were right about her. The Oversight Committee has approved her appointment as Federal Authentication Director." Winters nodded without surprise. She was always the right choice. It just took a near disaster for everyone else to see it. At the podium, Sophia continued outlining the center's mission with the same precise efficiency she brought to everything. But there was something new in her presentation, a quiet passion for protecting historical truth that had always driven her work, but rarely been expressed publicly. "We cannot change the past," she concluded, "but we can ensure its authentic representation is protected with every verification tool and ethical standard at our disposal." The McAllister forgeries weren't just an attack on institutional credibility. They were an attempt to rewrite history itself. Our job is to make sure such attempts never succeed. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for her words, but for what she represented: expertise that persisted despite being overlooked, integrity that stood firm despite being dismissed, and a commitment to truth that transcended personal recognition. As Sophia stepped away from the podium, Barrett approached with his hand extended. "We should have listened to you from the beginning." She accepted the handshake with professional courtesy. "The important thing is that you're listening now. Historical truth doesn't care who gets the credit for preserving it, just that it survives intact." Later that evening, after the crowds had dispersed and the exhibition hall had quieted, Sophia walked alone through the displays. She paused at a case containing forgery detection tools, some dating back centuries, magnifying glasses, chemical testing kits, comparative analysis frameworks. The tools changed, but the fundamental mission remained constant, separating historical fact from fabrication. Dr. Winters found her there, contemplating the display with thoughtful attention. Not bad for someone they tried to erase from the historical record. Sophia smiled slightly. "I was never interested in making history, just protecting it. And yet, here you are, making it anyway." He gestured toward a photograph on the wall, showing Sophia at her workstation during the McAllister authentication, the quiet specialist who saved an institution from itself. "One case among many," she demurred. "Perhaps, but this one changed something fundamental." Winters handed her an envelope bearing federal seals. "Your appointment as Director of Federal Historical Authentication Operations. The Oversight Committee was unanimous. Sophia accepted the envelope without opening it. This will mean leaving the shadows behind. Yes, he agreed. Sometimes protecting history requires stepping into it. Your particular expertise is needed now more than ever. We're seeing sophisticated forgery networks operating across multiple institutions. They're getting better at what they do. Then we'll get better at stopping them. The simple statement carried absolute conviction. As they walked toward the exit, Sophia glanced back at the exhibition, the visible manifestation of lessons learned through failure and redemption. For 15 years, she had worked in academic obscurity, her contributions minimized or overlooked, her expertise dismissed until crisis forced recognition. Yet she had persisted, not for acknowledgement, but because historical truth mattered more than personal credit. Now that persistence had transformed into something unexpected, a platform to ensure others wouldn't face the same dismissal. A chance to build systems where expertise was valued regardless of academic pedigree or institutional status. The institution that had tried to erase her from the historical record had instead become the foundation for her most important work, creating a future where historical truth was protected by people who recognized that sometimes the quietest voice in the room might be the one most worth hearing. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us. 6 months after the opening of the Center for Historical Authentication and Verification Ethics, Sophia stood in her new office at the Federal Historical Authentication Bureau headquarters. The space was larger than her previous workspace, but maintained the same practical functionality. The walls now displayed framed authentication certificates and specialized training credentials, visible reminders of a career spent protecting historical truth. Her desk held a series of files marked with priority classifications. Reports of sophisticated forgery networks operating across multiple institutions had increased dramatically since the McAllister case made headlines. Rather than discourage forgers, the publicity had seemingly inspired more ambitious attempts to manipulate the historical record. A knock at her door interrupted her review. Dr. Winters entered, accompanied by a serious-looking woman Sophia recognized as Deputy Director Rivera from the National Archives. Director Lakewood, Winters began with formal address that still felt strange to Sophia's ears. "We have a situation that requires your immediate attention." Sophia gestured for them to take seats. "What am I looking at?" Rivera placed a sealed portfolio on the desk. 3 weeks ago, a previously unknown collection of Abraham Lincoln correspondence surfaced at auction houses in New York, Chicago, and London simultaneously. Private collectors have already purchased 8 letters for amounts exceeding $15 million total. 3 major universities are in negotiations to acquire the remaining documents. Sophia opened the portfolio, examining the high-resolution images with practiced scrutiny. Provenance? A previously unknown descendant of Lincoln's personal secretary. Claims the letters were stored in a family vault for generations. Documentation appears comprehensive, but you wouldn't be here if you weren't concerned, Sophia finished, already noting subtle inconsistencies in the handwriting samples. Winters leaned forward. The authentication firms hired by the auction houses have all certified the letters as genuine. These are respected companies with international reputations. Sophia's eyes narrowed as she examined a particular passage in one of the letters. "And yet you're still concerned." Rivera nodded. "The content is historically significant. These letters suggest Lincoln was considering radical approaches to reconstruction that contradict everything we've previously understood about his policies. If genuine, they would fundamentally alter our understanding of post-Civil War planning and rewrite every textbook on the period," Sophia added, still studying the documents. "What's our timeline?" The remaining letters go to auction in 3 days. Once they enter university collections and research begins based on their content. Winters let the implication hang in the air. The contamination becomes permanent, Sophia concluded. She closed the portfolio and stood. I'll need immediate access to the Federal Authentication Lab and a team of our top specialists. Already assembled, Winters replied, there's one more complication. The authentication firms have staked their reputations on these letters. They're not going to appreciate federal intervention. Historical truth doesn't care about hurt feelings, Sophia said, gathering her materials. Assemble the team. We have 3 days to prevent a historical distortion that could last generations. The Federal Authentication Laboratory occupied 3 subterranean levels beneath an unremarkable government building in Washington, D.C. Few people knew of its existence, and fewer still had authorization to access its specialized equipment and restricted databases. Sophia strode through the main authentication floor, where teams of specialists worked at advanced stations examining documents, artifacts, and digital records. The facility represented the culmination of decades of authentication science, a place where historical truth was protected with technological precision and methodological rigor. James Whitfield, now 6 months into his specialized training program, looked up from his workstation as Sophia approached. Dr. Lakewood, they told me you requested me for this operation. I need someone who can recognize the patterns we're looking for, she replied. Your work on the McAllister case showed promise. The young authentication specialist straightened with pride at the recognition. What are we looking at? Sophia activated the central display system, bringing up high-resolution images of the Lincoln letters. Potentially the most sophisticated forgery operation we've encountered. These documents have already passed authentication at 3 separate firms. We have 72 hours to determine if they're genuine before they permanently alter historical scholarship. Around the laboratory, specialized teams assembled, chemical analysis experts, handwriting verification specialists, historical context researchers, provenance investigators. Each represented the pinnacle of authentication science, professionals who had dedicated their careers to separating historical fact from fabrication. These letters have already been certified by Westridge Authentication and Global Verification Partners. One of the senior specialists noted, those firms don't make mistakes lightly. Everyone makes mistakes, Sophia replied, her focus unwavering. Our job is to determine if that's what happened here, or if we're looking at something more deliberate. James, I want you focused on contextual verification. Cross-reference every historical claim in these letters against verified Lincoln correspondence. Flag any inconsistencies, no matter how minor. As the teams dispersed to their specialized tasks, Sophia moved to the advanced imaging station. The system could detect alterations invisible to the naked eye, revealing layer patterns that could distinguish genuine historical documents from even the most sophisticated forgeries. For the next 18 hours, the laboratory operated at maximum capacity. Teams worked in coordinated precision, each examining different aspects of the Lincoln letters with specialized tools and methodologies. Sleep was replaced by coffee, meals were consumed at workstations, and findings were continuously compiled on the central database. Sophia moved between stations, reviewing results with focused attention. The chemical analysis showed aging consistent with period-appropriate materials. Handwriting verification identified pattern consistency with verified Lincoln documents. Initial results suggested authenticity, exactly what the previous authentication firms had concluded. At hour 20, James approached Sophia's workstation, his expression revealing the tension of someone who had discovered something significant but wasn't entirely confident in his findings. Dr. Lakewood, I've been cross-referencing the contextual elements against the verified Lincoln database, and something isn't adding up. Sophia looked up from her analysis. Show me. James displayed his findings on the nearby screen. These Letters reference Reconstruction policies using terminology that didn't enter political discourse until the 1870s, years after Lincoln's assassination. The concepts might have existed, but the specific language used to describe them came later. Sophia examined the highlighted passages with intense focus. Good catch, what else? The letter discussing the Supreme Court mentions justices by their full formal titles, a protocol Lincoln never followed in his verified correspondence. He consistently used more casual references in his personal letters. It was a subtle inconsistency, the kind that standard authentication protocols might overlook, but that revealed a fundamental pattern. Sophia turned to the central communication system. All teams redirect focus to linguistic and contextual verification. Prioritize terminology analysis against the verified Lincoln database. Look for anachronistic language patterns and formal structure inconsistencies. The laboratory shifted focus with practiced efficiency. Chemical and physical authentication continued, but now with additional emphasis on the linguistic and contextual elements that James had identified. Specialists who had been examining paper fibers and ink composition turned their attention to historical language, patterns, and period-appropriate terminology. At hour 36, the evidence began accumulating. What had initially appeared to be perfect forgeries were revealing subtle but undeniable inconsistencies, formal language structures that didn't match Lincoln's writing style, references to events using terminology that emerged years later, and most damning of all, subtle policy positions that contradicted Lincoln's verified views while supporting contemporary political narratives. Sophia assembled the team leaders at the central conference table, the exhaustion of continuous work evident in their postures, but determination still clear in their eyes. What we're looking at is more than standard forgery, she began. These documents were created to deliberately reshape historical understanding of Lincoln's Reconstruction policies. They've been manufactured with exceptional skill, using period-appropriate materials and handwriting techniques that fooled multiple authentication firms. How do we proceed? Asked the chemical analysis lead. We have conclusive evidence of contextual inconsistencies, but the physical authentication still supports authenticity. Sophia studied the assembled findings displayed across multiple screens. That's exactly what makes these forgeries so dangerous. They're designed to pass standard authentication protocols while inserting subtle historical revisions. We need to compile a comprehensive report detailing every inconsistency for submission to the Federal Oversight Committee. The auction is in 27 hours, James noted. Even with conclusive evidence, the bureaucratic process might not move quickly enough to prevent the sales. Sophia nodded, acknowledging the reality of their situation. Which is why we need to approach this from multiple angles. I need a team to continue building the technical case while I address the authentication firms directly. With respect, Director, one of the senior specialists interjected. Those firms have staked their professional reputations on these certifications. They won't easily acknowledge they've been deceived. They won't have a choice, Sophia replied, with quiet certainty. Historical truth doesn't negotiate. The headquarters of Westridge Authentication occupied the top floors of a gleaming Manhattan high-rise, all glass, chrome, and carefully cultivated prestige. The reception area displayed framed certifications of historical documents that had passed through their verification process, silent testament to their position as industry leaders. Sophia stepped from the elevator flanked by Dr. Winters and two federal agents carrying sealed portfolios. Her government credentials granted immediate access despite the receptionist's obvious surprise at an unscheduled federal visit. Marcus Westridge himself emerged from the conference room, his expression shifting from irritation to concern as he recognized the federal credentials. Director Lakewood, this is unexpected. Mr. Westridge, we need to discuss the Lincoln correspondence your firm recently authenticated. His posture stiffened defensively. Those certifications followed our complete authentication protocol. Every document passed with the highest confidence rating. I'm aware, Sophia replied evenly. That's precisely why I'm here. Inside Westridge's private office, Sophia laid out the federal authentication findings with methodical precision. Each inconsistency was documented with supporting evidence, each anachronism highlighted with comparative examples from verified Lincoln correspondence. Westridge's face grew increasingly pale as he examined the evidence. This is impossible. Our specialists conducted comprehensive analysis. The physical authentication was conclusive. Your physical authentication was meant to be conclusive, Sophia corrected. These forgeries were specifically designed to pass standard protocols while inserting subtle historical revisions. Your firm was deliberately targeted because of your reputation. If this reaches the public, Westridge began, the implications for his company's future clearly dawning on him. That depends entirely on your next actions, Sophia stated. In 24 hours, these letters go to auction. If that happens, the historical record becomes permanently contaminated. Your firm can either be remembered as part of the problem or part of the solution. Westridge studied the federal findings again, professional pride battling with the undeniable evidence before him. What are you proposing? A joint statement from all three authentication firms withdrawing certification based on newly discovered evidence, immediate notification to all potential buyers, complete transparency about the sophisticated nature of these forgeries to prevent similar attempts in the future. And if we refuse? Dr. Winters stepped forward. Then the Federal Historical Authentication Bureau will issue its own findings directly to the public, detailing how these forgeries passed private sector verification. The historical community will draw its own conclusions about the reliability of your protocols. The choice wasn't really a choice at all, and Westridge knew it. His firm's entire business model depended on trust and credibility, assets that would evaporate if they were seen defending falsified certifications after conclusive contrary evidence had been presented. I'll need to contact the other firms immediately, he said finally. We've arranged a secure conference call in 30 minutes, Sophia replied. Their representatives are already reviewing our findings. 20 hours later, Sophia stood in the observation gallery above the Federal Authentication Laboratory, watching teams process the now withdrawn Lincoln letters. The auction houses had surrendered the documents to federal custody, pending a comprehensive investigation into their origins. The authentication firms had issued a joint statement, acknowledging the sophisticated forgery and committing to protocol revisions. Dr. Winters joined her at the observation window. Quite the outcome. 3 major authentication firms admitting failure, auction houses returning millions in deposits, and a sophisticated forgery ring exposed. Not bad for 48 hours. Work. Sophia's attention remained on the authentication teams below. The work is just beginning. These forgeries are part of a pattern, the same methodology we saw with the McAllister collection but more sophisticated. Someone is systematically attempting to rewrite pivotal moments in American history. You believe it's organized? The precision suggests coordination beyond individual forgers. The specific historical narratives being inserted indicate an agenda. This isn't random, it's targeted historical revision. Winters studied her with newfound appreciation. You've been tracking this for years, haven't you? Even when no one was listening. Sophia turned from the window, her expression revealing nothing but professional focus. Historical truth doesn't disappear just because people ignore it. Neither do those who try to manipulate it. The Oversight Committee has approved your request for a specialized task force, Winters informed her. Full authorization to investigate connected cases across multiple institutions. For the first time in days, Sophia allowed herself a small smile. Then it's time we stopped playing defense. If someone is trying to rewrite history, I want to know who and why. 3 weeks later, Sophia addressed the newly formed Historical Authentication Task Force in the secure briefing room at Bureau headquarters. The team represented diverse expertise: authentication specialists, historical researchers, forensic analysts, and investigation experts drawn from institutions across the country. James Whitfield sat among them, his recent performance having earned him a permanent position despite his relative inexperience. The room quieted as Sophia activated the central display system, bringing up a chronological timeline of connected forgery cases spanning 5 years. What you're looking at is a pattern that became visible only when we started connecting isolated incidents across multiple institutions, she began. 17 separate forgery cases, each targeting pivotal historical moments, each designed to subtly alter our understanding of American history. The display highlighted connections between seemingly unrelated forgeries, similar techniques, overlapping provenance claims, consistent historical revisions that pushed specific narratives. These aren't random forgeries motivated by financial gain, Sophia continued. They represent a coordinated attempt to reshape historical understanding. The technical sophistication suggests resources beyond individual forgers. The consistent narrative adjustments indicate ideological motivation. She advanced the display to show a network map connecting authentication firms, auction houses, and academic institutions that had encountered the forgeries. Our mission is to identify the sources of these forgeries, expose the network behind them, and prevent further contamination of the historical record. This isn't just about catching criminals, it's about protecting the integrity of history itself. As the briefing continued, Sophia outlined investigation protocols and authentication procedures designed specifically to counter the sophisticated techniques they'd encountered. Each team received specialized assignments targeting different aspects of the forgery network. When the formal briefing concluded, James approached Sophia with the cautious respect of someone still adjusting to his new role. "I've been reviewing the pattern analysis from the Lincoln forgeries, and I noticed something that might connect to the McAllister case." "Show me," Sophia replied, her interest immediately engaged. James displayed his findings on a nearby monitor. The handwriting variations follow a similar algorithmic pattern, almost like they were generated using the same technological approach but refined between attempts. Sophia studied the analysis with focused attention. "Good catch. This suggests the forgers are learning from each failure, adapting their techniques to overcome specific authentication protocols, which means they likely have inside knowledge of how authentication procedures work," James concluded. "Or access to someone who does," Sophia added, the implications already forming in her mind. "Expand your analysis to include all 17 cases. Look for progression patterns in the forgery techniques." As James departed to continue his analysis, Sophia remained at the briefing table, studying the connected cases with the methodical attention that had defined her career. For 15 years, she had worked in the shadows, her contributions minimized or overlooked, her expertise dismissed until crisis forced recognition. Now she stood at the center of a federal task force, leading specialists who recognized the value of her methodologies and respected her uncompromising commitment to historical truth. The institution that had tried to erase her from history had instead positioned her to become its most dedicated defender. The path ahead would challenge every authentication protocol and investigative technique at their disposal. The forgery network had resources, expertise, and a clear agenda. They had already successfully placed fraudulent documents in prestigious collections and nearly corrupted historical scholarship with manufactured evidence. But they had never faced someone like Sophia Lakewood, a specialist who had spent her career being underestimated and overlooked while perfecting the art of seeing what others missed. Someone who understood that sometimes historical truth required personal sacrifice, and that the most important victories often came without public recognition. As she reviewed the connected cases, Sophia felt a quiet certainty settle over her. The people behind these forgeries had made a critical mistake. They had assumed that because they could erase someone from historical recognition, they could also erase historical truth itself. They were about to discover how wrong they were. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.